Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to continue on with our exponent rules. Now, with the assignment from yesterday, you guys will be getting some feedback, and we're going to be doing some corrections on the assignment from today and the assignment from yesterday tomorrow, so make sure that you don't lose that. So what we're going to work with today, though, is zero and negative exponent, so our two new rules. You're going to like this first one. This one's quite easy. Anytime you raise something to the zero power, it's going to equal 1. This is like saying, let's say we had a 5 plus a 2x squared or something. What it's saying is, well, we kind of have an x there, it's just raised to the zero power. So you could have also written this as 5x to the 0 plus 2x squared, since this is the same as writing 1. And we know that 5 times 1 is just 5. So that's basically what they're saying here. But the nice thing about that is anytime you see something raised to the zero power, doesn't matter what it is, you can just write 1. Now be careful, a lot of people write 0 just by mistake, so watch that you double check your rule before you actually write this one down, okay? It is 1, not 0, otherwise the whole thing would disappear and that wouldn't be good. Okay, so our second rule is a little bit more extensive, but not by much. So with this rule, I've actually broken it into two parts so you can see what it does. But let's say we had x to a negative exponent, something like 2 to the negative 3. Well, 2 to the negative 3 is hard to solve, but we do know that 2 to the third is just 2 times 2 times 2, or 8. So what this is saying is you can still do that 2 to the third, but it's just getting flipped around. It's the opposite of what you'd normally do. And so what it's saying is take whatever position it's in a fraction and make it its reciprocal. So here, instead of doing 2 to the third, I'm doing 1 over 2 to the third. It just goes to the denominator of the fraction, which gives us 1 over 8. And so that's how we can get a positive exponent always. You just take it and you switch it to the other side of the fraction. Same thing happens when it's already in the bottom of the fraction. So let's say we had 1 over, let's do 1 over 3 to the negative second. Okay, we're just going to flip those around. Well, all it's saying is put it up at the top of the fractions. Now we have got 1 times 3 to the negative 2, and since there's nothing down here, it's just a 1. And that would go, to a positive 2. As soon as you move it, you're going to lose that negative. That changes it to its positive, and we'd get 3 to the second, or 3 squared, which is 9. 3 times 3. So see how this negative is just switching its position. And you gotta watch out that you lose the negative when you bring it up to the top or down to the bottom. So let's try out a few of these with these rules and see how they feel. And man, do I ever have a lot of them. But don't worry, some of them are easier than you think. So let's start with this. 9 to the negative second. Well, 9 to the negative second just means move it to the bottom of a fraction. So I can lose my negative because I'm moving it to the bottom of a fraction, and I'm just putting the 1 on top because there's nothing else in our fraction. So I've got 1 over 9 squared. Now, of course, I can square 9. We know that 9 times 9 is 81, but I don't have to. Either answer is correct. I just don't want negatives in my exponents. So that brings us to 3. What about 1 over negative 3 to the negative 4? Don't let this negative bother you. This negative is inside the parentheses, so currently it's trapped. Plus, it has nothing to do with the exponent at this point. The exponent, however, does have a negative number, and I don't want that negative number, so I'm going to move it to the top of my fraction. And that would give us negative 3 to the 4th power. And while this 1 would be multiplied by it, it does nothing. And what's left in the bottom is just a 1. So that leaves us with negative 3 to the 4th. And thinking about this practically, by the way, a negative times a negative is always positive. And here we have a negative times a negative times a negative, which would give us a negative answer, times a negative. So in the end, our answer would be positive because these two would cancel out to become positive and these two would cancel out to become positive. So this would be the same as 3 to the 4th power. And that's a lot easier to write and less likely that we'll accidentally type this into our calculator wrong and end up with a negative where we shouldn't have it. So 3 to the 4th power would be the better answer here. Anytime, by the way, this exponent is even, you're going to end up with a positive answer regardless of whether or not this number is negative. Okay, so what about 187 to the negative 1? Well, don't forget that negative says send it to the bottom of a fraction. So we end up with 1 over 187 to the first power. And the first power actually doesn't do anything to the number. It just leaves it as it is because it's being multiplied by itself one time. In other words, it's just 187. So you will see this often as it wants you to just turn it into its reciprocal. Negative 1 is a shorthand for reciprocal. Okay, so now let's get a little bit more complicated. Here what we are saying is we have a to the 4th over b to the negative 2nd. Don't forget, as soon as you see a negative, you'll want to switch what part of the fraction it's on. But notice here we already have a to the 4th still at the top. So b to the 2nd is going to move next to it, and it's going to do so with multiplication in between. And what's left in the bottom is nothing, or just a 1 in this case. So whatever was being multiplied by the b, which is 1. And since anything over 1 is just itself, that leaves us with a to the 4th times b squared. Notice a to the 4th will not move because it has a positive exponent already. Had this been negative, it would have moved, but it's not. It's positive. So let's continue on with this. What about if I have a negative exponent and I have parentheses? Well, we know from before that this negative will distribute. So I could write this as y to the negative 2 times x to the negative 2, and I'm allowed to do that provided there's multiplication between the two things, which there is. And so I could do that. And you notice that this negative sends both of these, x and y, to the bottom of the fraction. So I have y to the 2nd, now positive, it traded in that negative to move to the bottom, and x to the 2nd, now positive. So I'd have 1 over y squared times x squared. I could have also solved this by saying, well, the negative tells me that the whole thing inside the parentheses will go to the bottom of the fraction. So I could have simply started out and just gone, well, y times x squared, and that negative sent it to the bottom. So that's our other option. Notice they give you the same answer because if I distributed this 2, I would end up with 1 over y squared x squared, which is what I wrote over here. So these two things mean the same. And if you need to distribute at this point, you may. And you're going to find that with exponents, you can go a lot of different paths to get to the same answer. Now, what about one like this, where we already have a fraction? Well, in this case, this is still going to distribute to the 1 and the 2. We're allowed to distribute if you have multiplication or division. So that means that what I really have here is 1 to the negative 3 over 2 to the negative 3. And I know that these negatives will send them to different places. So if I look at this negative up here, what that's saying is take your 1 to the negative 3 and put it at the bottom and then change that to a positive. And this 2 also needs to move because it too has a negative exponent. So again, only move them if they have that negative exponent, but it does have that negative exponent. So I'm going to move it up here towards the top where I have 2 to the 3rd. Now watch this one carefully. 1 to the 3rd is just 1 times 1, which is 1. So that means what I really have is 2 to the 3rd over 1, which is just 2 to the 3rd, or 8. And if you don't quite believe your answer, don't be afraid to type this in. 1/2 parentheses around it to the negative 3rd is 8. And you're always allowed to check, but I do need to see your work. Okay, just a few more to run through here. What about something like this where you have a string of them? Well, I've got 2 times x to the negative 2nd times y to the 3rd. Here, notice what has the negative. The only thing that has a negative exponent is x to the negative 2nd. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that to the bottom of my fraction, x squared. And again, it's positive now because it's in the bottom of my fraction. And 2 will not move because 2 here does not have a negative exponent. And y will not move because y does not have a negative exponent. So you have 2y to the third x squared. And I would like to remind you, always watch that you have only multiplication between or division, because otherwise it's going to mess us up. Okay, so number 9. Whew, we're almost there. 9 is 1/9 to the 0. Guess what? No work necessary here, because anytime something's raised to the 0 power, it's just 1. And I'd be done. But, of course, there are still some more to do. So my next question is, what about when I have a fraction where some of the terms are negative and some are positive? I always go through first and just circle or highlight the ones that have the negative in the exponent. Watch, that's not in the bottom, but in the exponent. That's going to move it to the bottom or to the top, depending on what it was before. Well, here, my 3 will remain in the same spot. It is a coefficient. It does not have a negative exponent, so there's no negative up here. My x squared is also a positive exponent, so it stays at the top. My y will move to the bottom to trade in that negative, and my z to the 5th, which was in the bottom, will remain in that denominator, that bottom. So we have this as our final answer. I'm going to skip this one. Oh, no, actually, I'm going to keep this one. Let's look at this one real quick. So we have c to the negative 2 times negative x to the 5th times d to the 3rd. Okay, so first, I'm going to look at just my exponents. Which ones are negative? This one's negative, and this one's negative. Notice that while our x itself is negative, its exponent is positive, so it stays where it was. So I'm going to just write that one right now so I don't forget that that's going to stay there. Now, my c squared, or c to the negative second, moves to the bottom and becomes c to the second, a positive 2. And my d to the negative third will move to the top and become d to the third. So this is what I end up with as my final answer. Perhaps you, working ahead, ended up with negative x to the 5th times d to the 3rd over c squared. So it's the same thing, just the top flip-flopped. That's okay, because we're allowed to multiply in any order that we want. And if you saw this bottom problem and were like, oh, I can't do that, you definitely can. Notice how this whole thing is in parentheses. That means that this exponent applies to the whole thing. Now, could I simplify this inside? Yes, I actually could. I could do a lot of simplification. But since it's raised to the 0 power, no matter what I simplified it to, I'd still end up with an answer of 1. Because anything raised to 0 power is just 1. And since this whole thing is, we have an answer of 1. So watch for these. These things are going to be your friend. They are going to make it so you don't have to do nearly as much work. And I promise you, on a quiz, I'm going to have one like this. Don't waste your time. Always check. Do you have anything to the 0 power? All right. What I want you guys to do for homework is the following. Go to page 453 in your book. And what I want you to do is 21 through 28, which, by the way, it's going to say evaluate the expression. I'm okay with your final answer being like this. If you have something like 1 over 4 to the second, I'm okay with that being your final answer. I'm also okay with you actually squaring it and giving me 1 over 16. But I do want fractions and not decimals. So either of these are okay, but you cannot do a decimal answer. I want exact. And I need to see your work. Otherwise, it will not count. So even if it's only one step, that's okay. Like if you're circling the negative exponent from the original, like if we had 4 to the negative second, if all you're doing is circling it and going like this, that's fine. It shows me that you understood. That's why I'm making you do this, okay? So 21 through 28, those will go pretty quick. And then a few harder ones, let's go with 51 through 62. I want you guys to work through these very slowly and carefully. It might make you do some of the multiplication rules that we had earlier. Don't be afraid of that. Don't also be afraid to drop in if you need to ask some questions. I'll be on from 10:30 to 11:30 as per usual, and you can contact me throughout the day. Hope you guys have a good one. See you soon.